This morning, we're joined by Aleksandr Karp, the Chief Executive of Palantir Technologies, a leading data analytics company in Silicon Valley. We're going to be talking about Palantir's role in trying to work with the terrible problem of COVID-19 and other issues involving data analytics. Let's talk a little bit about Palantir and what it does. You often like to stress what it doesn't do. It doesn't own data. It's not in the business of sharing data, but it is in the business of analyzing big data. And maybe you could just explain to us what this technology that Palantir applies to data is all about. When somebody retains Palantir, becomes one of your customers, what are they buying from Palantir?
There's what they're buying and what they're getting. What they're in the end buying is a result based on their data so that they can make a decision, not that we can make a decision. And how they make the decision comes down to their level of technical acuity. Some people use ML at the final mile. Some people use data analytics. But what they're actually buying is a platform built years before it was needed that would allow you to replace, or in some cases replace parts of your platform that you would need to answer seemingly simple questions. So as an example, if you have hundreds and hundreds of data sets and you have to ask a simple question of how many people can fit into this hospital in this neighborhood, you've got to integrate all those data sets before you can ask and answer that question. And then you have to have a series of software products. And you may have 3 of the software products, but you don't have 14 of them. And so what Palantir does is we essentially collapse the time needed from the time you realize that your infrastructure is not working to the time you can ask and answer the question. And we did that by essentially predicting that times before 5 or 6 years out before we built the product would be very different than when we built the product. And so our product is used to maintain airplanes, to help people drill for oil and gas in the national security context. It powers most of the police intelligence work in Europe and because of its data protection. But what you're really getting is an ability to replace or augment the software products you have overnight or within the context of a couple weeks so that you can ask and answer questions in a critical context, either in the commercial or the government context. And that's how we ended up being the engine behind most anti-terror institutions in the West, a number of the largest economic institutions in the West, and why Palantir is in 35 countries helping to mitigate the disaster incurred in the wake of the COVID pandemic.
I want to ask about Palantir's origin story, which, as you said, is in the counterterrorism CT area. It's said sometimes about Palantir in print that your technology was useful to the Obama administration and to the CIA under Leon Panetta in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Let me just ask you, is that true?
I mean, it's one of those questions, obviously, when you run a company like mine, you're never allowed to answer. But what I can tell you is, Palantir has disrupted some of the largest terror attacks you've never heard of. Many of the anti-terror events you read about are, in fact, the result not of Palantir, but of the incredible people that use Palantir all over the world.
We'll stick with that as an answer. Let's turn to the COVID nightmare, which is something causing death and destruction around the world today, and the way in which Palantir is working with the Department of Health and Human Services, I think also with Operation Warp Speed, to try to help get better analytics. Alex, as we look at the development of vaccines, we're all just extraordinarily pleased by how fast that happened. But as we look at the distribution process seeming to break down, we throw up our hands again. What would Palantir be able to do to help HHS in this period going forward, distributing vaccines, getting the country healthy again, preparing for the next pandemic?
Well, Palantir is involved globally and the 2 places we're most prominently involved are the US, UK, but a number of other countries in allowing people who are doing the planning to understand exactly what's happening on the ground, distribute PPE. So, for example, which hospitals are overutilized, which hospitals have capacity, which hospitals need PPE, which ones have too much, which ones have too little. And then on vaccine distribution, most notably in the U.S. and the U.K. The Operation Warp Speed, which uses Tiberius, is built on top of Foundry, uses
Foundry is your basic Palantir infrastructure, so our viewers will understand that.
And what Foundry allows them to see and decide is it's essentially a dashboard unifying the hundreds of data sets that make up the production of vaccines, the distribution of vaccines up to the state level. So how many vaccines are produced, how many can be shipped, and where do they go? The central issue in America, less so in England because they have a centralized healthcare system, is the delta between vaccines that are delivered to the state and the actual doses that arrive in people's arms. And so we have a serious issue with that in America, as is, I think, commonly known and was discussed by your guest yesterday, that there's roughly a 12 million delta between the vaccines, so roughly 17 million vaccines delivered to the states, roughly 5.4 administered. Palantir brings those vaccines to the states, and then there's a question as what we as a society can do to resolve that problem. Now, one of the things that makes America particularly interesting, complicated, and great is that states have a lot of rights, and they use local ways of distributing. Each one has a different infrastructure. One of the things that's super interesting about software is it allows you to compress time. So, what should not be possible distributing, we need to get roughly 300 million vaccines to America to hit herd immunity, is something that will only happen if we unify as a country and we use the best technology, especially software available, because the amount of vaccine per day is just surpasses what we would normally be doing as a country. The British distribution has certain attributes we don't have because they're just more centralized. But in any case, what we're doing is providing a dashboard so that every single person involved in Operation Warp Speed can actually track distribution, how much is being produced, where is it going, and if there's any disruptions between manufacturing and final handoff to the state.
Ask it to you as a data analyst, not in a political sense. Is it going to be possible to have an orderly system for distribution of this vaccine or future vaccines and future healthcare crises if we don't have in America a somewhat more centralized system so that we just have better, cleaner data and we know what's going on?
Well, another way of answering your question is to posit, which I think is unfortunately obvious, this will not be the last pandemic. And so, one of the things that's made American software companies dominant in the world is that we look at the mistakes that we've made, that we're making. We try to figure out what they were. We're fairly non-judgmental about them, and we iterate so that the next time around we're dramatically more effective. Assuming that this will happen again, there's a whole series of things we need to put in place. I mean, just banalities we all know, but they're so large we forget. Right now, 361 some Americans have died. That number within the next couple of weeks is going to surpass the number of people that died in World War II. This is already 100 times larger in terms of human life than what was inflicted upon us in 9/11. And so what would need to happen? Now, there are lessons both in building software companies and doing cybersecurity that are quite helpful. First of all, you need an unbroken chain between attribution. Where did the pandemic begin? How did it begin? Under what conditions did it begin? That data has to be something that is shared freely and examined internationally, not just by America, both so that we understand it and as credibility. That data has to be immediately shared with vaccine producers. We probably need to figure out a way to use the most advanced computational technologies we have, most advanced software technologies to accelerate vaccine production and approval. Approval, as you know, is a super important issue in America and broadly in the West. You have in all Western countries something like 30% of the population unwilling to take a vaccine. That's not just an American issue, by the way. You have roughly the same numbers in France, higher in France, roughly the same in Germany and in England. And to get herd immunity, you need to get probably to 80%. So we have a legitimation crisis on vaccines that is not primarily technology. And it can only, in my view, be solved by providing transparency in the actual approval and after it's administered, because otherwise we as another super hard thing that we have to look at is we do not want to pretend or obviously attempt to change the basic way in which we live in order to get pandemics under control. And that makes vaccines even more important, because if you're going to expand civil liberties and fight pandemics, you're going to have to do that with vaccine and increase legitimacy. Software, the way in which vaccines are developed, and honestly, more credible political leadership can actually make a huge difference in that problem. But you really need all three, because if the vaccine is delivered too slowly, then you have compounding math working against you. If the vaccine is delivered on time, but people don't believe they will take it, you can't get to herd immunity. And then in democracies, we need to convince people, not force people. And so those, by the way, the element of analytics, data integration, ML, AI will play a role in that whole chain. But they play a role primarily in two ways. One, acceleration of time, and two, creating transparency. By the way, transparency is a specialized issue, specialized concept in software, because you both create transparency of what's happening in the data, but you can anonymize the people involved in acquiring the data. And so that's obviously necessary in correspondence with our generally held civil liberties.
In terms of values, there's a kind of breakdown between what you see in the Valley and what you think is appropriate. In your S1 filing that accompanied some of the paperwork associated with going public, you said, we seem to share fewer and fewer of the technology sector's values and commitments. Then you went on to say, we've chosen sides, and we know that our partners value our commitments. And by chosen sides, you mean you really chosen sides with the United States, your country, and with Western democracies as a group. Do you feel that other Silicon Valley companies have failed to do that? And what advice would you give to the Google employee who's uncomfortable working on Project Maven or some other Pentagon project to try to convince him that that's a mistake?
There's a series of super important questions there. Just starting from the beginning, this country and a lot of the norms that we cherish was built on economic prosperity, in part powered by our ability to develop technology that was useful for individuals, not just useful in making a small number of people on the West Coast rich. And so that you have I would call Silicon Valley 1, which was the Manhattan Project, a lot of the technologies that are even powering this call. So computer technologies, internet technologies, those were built by the military and shared with humanity, both for America and the world's good. Consumer internet, you can debate it back and forth. It's very hard to define what utility it has. And I do in part blame it for creating an enormously tribalistic America where people are ever more convinced that their ever narrower opinion is the only one that matters. And that combined with, I think, great economic disparity, in part because we're not investing enough in technology, I think is responsible for some of the problems we have today, not all of them. And so I do think Silicon Valley has to ask very simple questions, and that I don't think everyone has to agree on the answer, but like, what is your value proposition, actual value proposition to the average person in America and among our allies in the world? Then you asked another set of questions, which is a super subtle question. And we had the same question at Palantir, but an employee that for whatever reason doesn't feel that their valuable efforts should support the military. And that's a completely legitimate opinion that should be part of the discourse. I would only say to that employee, but as importantly to the leaders of these companies, your company is worth hundreds of billions of dollars in part because the U.S. government and the West protect your right to engage in international economic behavior. You live in a system, you drive on our streets, and we are prospering disproportionately. And there's you can't live in a country and not support it. Last not least, I would point out to that employee that, and again, without being, you can't force someone to work against their conscience, but you can remind them, America has very serious, very, very competent adversaries that have a very different view of how the world should work and very different views of human rights and economic justice than most people in America. And we are living in a world of complexity where we may need to defend ourselves. Last not least, I would try to engage in a discourse around what do you think the consequences are going to be? Technologists realize that technology is nonlinear, so that it's much more, AI is much more like which Project Maven is working on, is much more like a nuclear bomb than a machine gun. And if one side has a gun and the other side has a nuclear bomb, the side that has a bomb will often decide that their way of seeing the world is the way of seeing the world. And I don't believe America's perfect. I've written a lot of critical things about the West and America in my former years as an academic, and I still believe some of those critical things. But I believe that a world order that is defined by, broadly speaking, Western democratic norms, the rule of law, fairness, separation of church and state, a general concept that things will be adjudicated in the court that will be followed, is a better system than a system that doesn't have those things. And a country which does not have the equivalent of software nuclear warfare because its best people won't work on it is a country that will not be able to engage in dialogue of equals on these very important issues. One of the things I'm hopeful about is that there'll be a less politicized environment. And a lot of these problems are actually only solved where people, a wider swath of people, are willing to actually say, we don't agree on some issues, but we do agree on these issues. And we're actually going to put our technology, our spirit, our efforts together and actually do something that can work. And in the national security context, especially technologists who know this is this is a non-linear situation, need to be involved because they understand this is the whole reason their companies are dominant, because you can't compete with a world-class software company if you're not world-class.
Thank you for joining us today on Washington Post Live.